Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now, in this episode, we're tackling a burning question. Why aren't Russians doing more to stop Putin's disastrous war in Ukraine? Is it fear, propaganda, or something else entirely? Now let's explore how political apathy, historical trauma, and plain old disillusionment created this mess. The one that's keeping Russia's people silent while their government wreaks havoc in Ukraine. But first, let's take a look at our latest report.
Analysts argued that Russians couldn't care less about the ongoing war, Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region, the country's recent elections and their unsurprising result, and their rampant corruption.
Thank God we have people who are resisting this tension, this pressure. So it's fine, we will cope.
Researchers say that the indifference stems from Russian society's attempts to minimize changes in its way of living and thinking despite the radical external changes that are unfolding. The manifest passivity could imply that the Russian society does not exist in a meaningful sense at all, being instead a collection of profoundly alienated individuals. The Moscow Times columnist Vladislav Inozemtsev argues that in a standard society, a person concentrates the most on what directly affects their lives, such as their jobs. Less focus is devoted to issues like state development and even less to foreign policy and defense doctrine. The distribution of attention contributes to the stability of a society based on the interaction of individual interests. But in Russia, atomized individuals are almost exclusively concerned with their personal interests and maintaining the status quo. This is why Russians consider protest. Within the Russian social system, the war and growing authoritarianism are perceived by many as an opportunity for extra income, government perks, or fresh professional avenues. In turn, a Russian citizen's pragmatism protects the state from a bottom-up revolt. And as Inozemtsev posits, only widespread poverty or the catastrophic collapse of Moscow's grand geopolitical dreams could shake Russians from out of their lethargy.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now, when we think about war protests, especially in the West, we imagine people taking to the streets, holding up signs, chanting catchy slogans, "Hell no, we won't go." But in Russia, it's more like, "Hell no, we won't even think about it." And that's not just because Putin has a nasty habit of, locking people up or daring to criticize him. No, the truth is, most Russians just don't care enough to even try. It's like everyone's collectively saying, let the guy with the nuclear button handle it. I'll just be over here suffering quietly. And let's be fair, there's a reason for this attitude. Apathy in Russia is as deep-rooted as Putin's Botox injections. And this isn't a new thing. It's a continuation of Soviet-era mentalities that were all about minding your own business, letting the higher-ups make decisions, and avoiding politics like it's a plague. In fact, they have a phrase for it. The folks up there see better, meaning if you're not in power, you've got no business thinking that you know what's going on. Combine that with modern-day state propaganda that's more relentless than a cat trying to knock over your coffee, and you've got a recipe for a population that's completely disengaged. But here's the thing. This isn't just some harmless indifference. It's like watching your country's house burn down and thinking, well, I didn't really like that sofa anyways. Right now, Russia's military losses in Ukraine are staggering. We're talking, by conservative estimations, over 500,000 casualties, way worse than the Soviet Union's entire decade-long war in Afghanistan, where only about 15,000 soldiers died. So you'd think Russians would be a little more worked up about it, right? Maybe storm the Kremlin with some pitchforks? No, instead, many just shrug and say, well, let's hope Putin figures this out with Biden and China. Now, according to polls from the Levada Center, 75% of Russians say that they support the war in Ukraine. That's a number the Kremlin likes to brag about, but here's where it gets weird. In those same polls, 71% of Russians also say that they support immediate peace talks. Let's pause and let that sink in. How can you be pro-war and pro-peace at the same time? See, Russia is an authoritarian state, and in those type of regimes, people aren't always telling pollsters what they really think. We call that a preference falsification. It's when you say what you think the government wants to hear just to stay out of trouble. But even that doesn't fully explain what's happening. Political apathy in Russia runs way deeper. Ask an average Russian what they want from this war, and most will tell you, I don't want anything, I've never thought about it. Why? Well, because for decades they've been trained not to care. They've been taught that politics is not for them, it's something for the people in power to deal with, and everyone else should just keep their heads down. So, what's next? Will the Russian people rise up, tear down the Putin regime, and end the war? Probably not anytime soon. Until then, though, the Russian public is likely to stay in wait-and-see mode, hoping for an end that doesn't involve nuclear fallout. Which is not far from where we stand either. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Rasmus Nielsen, lecturer from University College London. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So when it comes to the information space, I feel like we're almost living in a parallel universe here when it regards to Russia. A lot of times when we have questions about why they're making statements that are so bizarre that nobody would really believe it, the answer that I got is mostly, well, it's for domestic consumption. Just how big of a difference are we talking about when it comes to perception of this war and the world in general when it comes to the Russians and the West?
Well, if we're talking about what's happening on the battlefield and at the front line, I would actually wager that many Russians have quite a good understanding of what's going on, particularly the scale of the fighting, to some extent the scale of the casualties and so on. I mean, the Russian state can do what it wants in state-driven media, but Russians go on the internet, they use VPNs and so on, so they can easily get a lot of that information. The question then comes, of course, whether ordinary Russians want to access such information, or whether they simply want to sort of withdraw from the public space as much as possible, which is what I think is very often happening.
Right, you mentioned something pretty interesting here, them wanting to withdraw from the public space. I think we here in the West usually want more information, more transparency, want to know what's going on in the world. Where is this reluctance coming from when it comes to receiving information or just trying to figure out what's going on?
I think you're seeing this, what we can call perhaps atomization, going on over a number of years now. I would say at least a decade in Russia. And I would suspect that it often stems from a feeling of powerlessness. Now, don't get me wrong, there are people in Russia, definitely plenty of them, who genuinely support Putin and who genuinely support the war. But from what I can see, for a clear majority in Russia, there is a feeling of powerlessness. There is a feeling that they cannot influence affairs of the state anyway. They have no impact on the elite. And there is a belief that the elites are different. I mean, that many Russians would simply see the elites as, bandits to some extent, as people who do not have anything but their own interests at heart. And for ordinary Russians, therefore, there seems to be often no purpose in getting involved. I mean, if you go out and you protest against the war, even in what would normally be considered a private space, say in private chat rooms and so on, you can be arrested and you can face quite severe punishment. So there's an element of fear as well, of course, among the ordinary Russians. But yes, many Russians, most Russians, would not see a purpose in getting involved in any debate over the war.
And do you think that's a result of the culture or a result of more like the political structure that eventually resulted in what we're seeing today?
Well, attitudes are constructed, and there's obviously an element coming, an element of that construction coming from the bottom up, from society, and there's an element coming from the state. I don't think there's any doubt that the state over a number of years now has tried to depoliticize the public, meaning that it wants the public to turn up for, irregular events or rare events like, for instance, elections, but otherwise it wants the population to stay reasonably quiet. And now it's beginning to threaten the public, so the public will stay quiet. But I think this also goes all the way back historically to Soviet times. I mean, I don't want to overdo the comparison with Soviet times, but you can definitely start seeing some of the atomization and some of the private distancing from public affairs that you saw within the Soviet Union in the 70s and at least part of the 80s. You're seeing the same thing now, and you're seeing, I would wager also, some hopelessness, which is certainly not what the Russian state would want. They would want a public that is obedient, but that believes in the state's causes, that believes in Putin, a population that's ready to rise up for Russia. And as far as I can see, the Russian state has been able to depoliticize, to atomize its population, but it is not succeeding in motivating them to stand up for Russia actively.
All right, there's a phrase that I want to go back to because we usually, sometimes talk about ordinary Russians and their perception for the war, its political system. But at this point, what does that even mean? How do we categorize what a normal Russian is?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about, looking at Russians in public surveys and so on, it is extremely difficult because we know from any authoritarian country, really, particularly one in war, that it can be very difficult to get a real feel for people's opinions, a real feel for their circumstances and so on. I think if you're looking at ordinary Russians today, you're looking at Russians who know about the war, as I said before, but do not have that as their prime concern. The prime concern for most Russians now, I would wager, would be what is beginning to be an economic problem. A problem with inflation, a problem with lack of opportunity really for the country going forward and for individuals' private opportunities. And also, I would say, a worry about where the state will encroach on them next. So although I just said that the ordinary Russian might not be focused particularly on the war on most days, they are focused on how the war may impact them personally. So you saw Putin's message very recently that he wants to increase the Russian military once again. And that is, of course, something that for many ordinary Russians makes them think, will that impact me? Will I be mobilized, or will the people I love be mobilized? So in that sense, ordinary Russians are becoming, I think, more and more fearful and more wary of what's happening around them.
All right, there's a bit of discussion when it comes to the incursion into the Kursk region. People are saying that is a double-edged sword, and on the battlefield we seem to see that Russians are taking more of Donbass than Ukraine's taking of Kursk, but a lot of analysts are also saying that this does give a very big morale hit to the Russian side of things, especially when it comes to its internal politics. Do you think this apathetic kind of attitude will shift once Ukraine, Ukraine already stepped into Russia, but do you think that has shifted the perception of the war in any way?
Well, I think it may well have shifted some Russians' perceptions of the Russian state. I mean, we already knew, and many Russian citizens already knew, that the Russian state is not working particularly well. I'm talking domestically as well as in foreign affairs. But obviously, once you see Ukraine being able to make such an incursion into Kursk, and once you see the relatively feeble Russian state reaction to that incursion, well, that just underlined for many Russians that, the Russian state is not really in charge of its own territory. You can also see ordinary Russians complaining in Kursk, but elsewhere as well, about lack of state aid for, say, people who've had to flee from the combat zones, but also more generally increasing lack of welfare for ordinary people. And I do think that is damaging Putin's popularity among the Russian population. In terms of what happens in Ukraine, I take your point that Russia may have taken more land in Donbass than Ukraine has done in Kursk, but it's not a comparison I think we need to make. The point about the Ukraine war right now is, I would argue, Russia cannot win that war. Why? Because even if Ukraine were to give up tomorrow, even if Russia were to keep all of the land it currently has troops in, what does that solve? What problem inside Russia does that solve? Nothing at all, as far as I can see, and it would not create a groundswell of support inside Russia for Vladimir Putin. It would not increase his standing there, even if the war were to stop today with current front lines.
All right. Do you think at some point there will be a break point, a point of no return, where people inside Russia finally say, okay, this is enough, we're fed up, or any substantial change actually happen? Or is it just wishful thinking?
I think if you're talking about ordinary people, people on the street, so to speak, in Russia, I don't see them rising up against the Kremlin. I think there is far too much fear and far too much apathy for that now. What I can potentially see among ordinary Russians is that if a partial or general mobilization takes place, I can see people trying to flee again, certainly those with some means and some education. But I do not see ordinary people rising up against the state. Do I see the elites going up against Putin? Well, we keep hearing about this from some Western observers. It's not impossible, certainly not, and certainly Putin is worried. If he's worried about anything, he's worried about challenges from inside the Russian elite. I'm not seeing the signs quite yet, but obviously the longer the war goes on, the worse domestic troubles get, the bigger the risk that Putin eventually might face some challenge from inside the system itself.
Right. Actually, in the beginning of the war, probably about a year in or so, we heard a lot of political infighting, a little bit of drama within the Russian ranks itself. That seemed to have died down as time drags on. What happened there? Did it actually die down, or are there just less coverage about it?
Well, I think it's a few things. First of all, some of the most vocal opponents of the war in the beginning have, of course, either disappeared, gone to prison, or gone abroad. So that's one thing. Inside Russia itself, you might not see open sort of resistance to the state, but that is because many people in the elite, and I would say the vast majority, they're not concerned about the Russian state right now. They're concerned about their own fortunes, physical fortunes, whether they stay alive and free, but also whether they can keep their money or even earn more, say, on military contracts or what have you. So what you're actually seeing now, and you can see signs of this quite regularly if you look at domestic affairs in Russia, are Russian elites going up against each other, trying to take each other's company, trying to get each other thrown to jail, possibly using violence. We've seen some signs of that in Moscow in recent days. And I think that will continue. What I'm trying to say here is, I don't think we're going to a situation where the Russian state or the Kremlin will collapse, but I think we are slowly moving towards a situation that's looking a bit like Russia in the 90s. That is, where you have oligarchs, where you have people with some state connections going up against each other to try and get the funds and the assets that are available inside Russia. And although Putin might be able to clamp down on individual cases, he can't clamp down on all of them. So I think that's what you're beginning to see. And I think, signs of that are coming up. Again, in Moscow, we've seen trouble in recent days. You've seen the arrest of people within the Ministry of Defense and so on. These are intra-elite fightings. And we will keep seeing that and see more of that, I would believe.
All right. Thank you so much for your input and insight. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you.
And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Ukraine has come up with a brand new blueprint designed to fine-tune decision-making in its defense sector. Let's take a look.
The Ukrainian Defense Ministry's planning, programming, budgeting and execution model will lay out the development of the armed forces capabilities over the next 5 to 10 years in line with NATO standards. The cornerstone of this model is a transparent allocation of expenditures across critical areas. The allocation will be executed based on a multi-criteria analysis of defense capability development, with the cost of each capability calculated in accordance with actual resource needs. The model is scheduled to be implemented by the end of 2025 and will eventually cover all components of Ukraine's defense forces.
Testing of a website for an online military draft system has begun in Russia in a bid to prevent call-up evasion. Here's more.
To prevent draftees from dodging military service, Moscow has created a Samos website, which is currently undergoing testing. This follows the signing of a law last year that prohibits draftees from leaving the country once they receive electronic call-up papers. Now a draft notice is considered received the moment it appears on the website. Individuals are then obliged to check their own names on the dedicated online portal. Failure to report for service within 20 days of receiving an online summons will have consequences, including bans on driving, applying for loans, and registering a business. Reportedly, the system is currently undergoing testing in the Ryazan and Sakhalin regions, as well as the Republic of Mariel. A nationwide launch of the military draft website is scheduled for November 1st, which coincides with a call-up later this fall.
Moscow, seemingly bitter with Armenia for its pivot to the West, has reportedly paid and trained an insurgent cell to overthrow the Yerevan government.
Armenian prosecutors said Moscow had paid and trained a ring of insurgents hoping to overthrow Armenia's pro-Western government earlier this year. The officials claimed 6 Armenians were recruited to undergo 3 months of training in Russia and were paid monthly salaries of over $2,000 while learning how to handle weaponry. The clique members' background was also reportedly checked and polygraph tests were done to determine their allegiances. The insurgents-to-be were then transferred to the Arbat military base in Rostov-on-Don, southern Russia. Armenia's local security forces thwarted the alleged plot. A total of 7 people would be charged with preparing to usurp power, using violence and the threat of violence to take over the powers of government.
Mexico's president-elect has turned down her Ukrainian counterpart's invitation to Kyiv, citing focus on domestic responsibilities, one of which being the preparation of the presidential inauguration scheduled for October 1st, with Vladimir Putin on a guest list.
Mexico's first female president-to-be, Claudia Sheinbaum, rejected the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's invitation to visit Kyiv after taking office on October 1st. At the same time, she found no fault in inviting Russia's leader Vladimir Putin to the ceremony. Sheinbaum explained her refusal by saying that addressing domestic issues would be her administration's main focus. The president-elect is expected to continue her predecessor's Andrés Manuel López Obrador's approach of non-intervention in foreign affairs. Mexico maintains diplomatic relations with both Moscow and Kyiv while adhering to a policy of neutrality regarding the war. With the International Criminal Court arrest warrant on Putin's head, Ukraine and the EU have pressured Mexico to arrest the Russian leader. Putin has already dared to test the power of the ICC warrant by traveling to Mongolia late last month.
And that is all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.